Welcome, friends, to another Wolff Responds. I call this one the United States and Europe a messy divorce. And that's what I want to talk to you about, how the war on Iran, waged by the United States and Israel, is having as one of its many unexamined, unanticipated effects a growing divorce proceeding between the United States and Europe. But before I do, I want to note a historical moment that will get, as many of them do, little or no attention in the United States. The year 1960 was very important in the history of much of the world, but particularly Africa. In 1960, the anti-colonial revolutions that swept Africa around that time reached the Congo. The Congo, arguably the richest part of an already rich continent, had been colonially wasted away by the Belgian government. And the people of the Congo had finally rebelled and, like Africans in many parts of that continent, driven out the Belgians the way they had driven out the Germans, the French, the British, and so on. A very dynamic, explosively powerful orator and organizer in that country was named Patrice Lumumba. Perhaps some of you listening or watching to what I'm saying know about him. Remember, if you were alive then, the brief moment of history that he experienced. A very young man. If you're interested in the rich background, one of the great novelists of the United States, Barbara Kingsolver, wrote a book called The Poisonwood Bible. Received many awards a few years ago. Read it. It's really about the story of Patrice Lumumba. The Belgian authorities, working with those Africans they could buy, which, having been there for a long time, were a significant number of Africans, arrested Mr. Lumumba a few months after he came to power as the first new, really African government of this African Congo country. And the Belgians and their allies arrested him, transported him, tortured him beyond words, killed him, and then dissolved his body in acid so there would be no record. Except just before they did that, the Belgian overseer watching this took away Mr. Lumumba's tooth. And in a ceremony recently, they buried his tooth in an honor funeral for Mr. Lumumba, now 65 years after he was murdered. He's a genuine hero of the African movement for independence. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because after decades of lies and fakery about all of this, the Belgian government has arrested an old leftover noble, a Mr., let me get it for you here, Davignon. Mr. Davignon has been arrested and now will be tried for being part of the group that did to Congo and Lumumba what I just described. This is the same man who has a long history in the leading layers of Belgian diplomacy and who was elevated to the old feudal standard of being a count by the King of Belgium. Yeah, they still have kings, as recently as 2018. History moves slowly, but sometimes it moves in the direction of something you might even call a tiny bit of justice. Lumumba has inspired generations of really important leaders of the anti-colonial movement still going on in Africa. Okay, I hope you will pardon me for taking the time to mark a historical moment. The war in Iran, now in its third week and counting, has proven many things. And you're reading and watching all kinds of material about it. I want to focus on one of the many aspects, not because it's the most important, it isn't, and not because there aren't a few other coverages of it, but because I think I can take it a step or two further that's worth understanding in terms of the long-term historical implications of that war. 3 or 4 days ago, Mr. Trump, as President of the United States, asked the Europeans to help. He specifically made it clear that he needed naval assistance as well as other kinds of assistance to try somehow to deal with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, that I'm sure you've heard all about, that the Iranians have effectively closed except for the ships that they permit to go through there, which they always have permitted and which they're continuing to permit. They are not permitting ships associated with the United States or Israel or any of their allies. When he asked, it put the leaders of the European countries in an extraordinarily difficult moment. On the one hand, as they have done for half a century, they wanted to, and some of them started, to compete with one another to suck up to Mr. Trump to do what he asked. But one by one, within 24, 48 hours after thinking to say yes to Mr. Trump, maybe if not with the ships, although some said they would do that, they would at least let the United States use military bases. You see, the United States needed European military bases because its allies in the Gulf and the Gulf area were unable to let the United States use their bases, not because they wouldn't give permission, but because the Iranians were blowing their bases up, one by one. But over the 24 or 48 hours, the European countries, at first led by Spain, then Italy, then a waffling Britain, and then even Mr. Merz in Germany, and finally even Mr. Macron, who does still retain the title Biggest Suck Up in Europe. They all turned Mr. Trump down, and in typical Trump fashion, he immediately insulted virtually every one of them, blamed them, explained bitterly how the United States had always sacrificed for Europe, and Europe had never done anything for them, and other behavior normally appropriate to someone who's between 4 and 6 years of age. But it made no difference. The divorce between Europe and the United States is underway and getting messier. The Europeans caved when Mr. Trump smacked them with tariffs. He didn't negotiate before he did it. He just hit them. And then he was willing to negotiate a reduction of tariffs if and only if the Europeans agreed to buy very expensive natural gas from the United States and invest European money, $700–800 billion worth, in the United States. In other words, he lowered the tariff he imposed unilaterally if and only if they paid tribute to the United States. This strained the marriage of Europe and the United States, to say the least. And it came right after Mr. Trump sharply reduced the U.S. support financially for the war in Ukraine, which also stimulated the Europeans to bitter recrimination. But they still went along. They still clearly believed that their salvation, and I'm talking now about the leading groups, the right wing, because it's very right wing, political leadership of Europe at this moment, exempting a few countries like Spain. But the reality is, they still thought that their best political hope was to demonize Russia, to kind of keep the Cold War going or re-implant one. Who cares that it isn't the Soviet Union anymore? It's Russia embracing capitalism and rejecting socialism. Detail they didn't notice. Demonize Russia, suck up to the United States. And you know they're right. They're in such trouble. Every one of these European governments is very unpopular. There were municipal elections last Sunday in France, for example, in which Mr. Macron, the president there, his party was virtually wiped out by the rising left wing and the rising right wing. Their days are numbered. They're desperate. How do they hold on to a population that is furious with them? And why? Because everything Europe has done, sucking up to the United States, especially around the Ukraine war, in the early years of it, cost the Europeans dearly. Their energy prices tripled because they sanctioned the evil Russia. And so they had to pay much more for American natural gas than they had used to pay for the oil and gas that cheaply came out of Russia. And when they had higher energy costs, it meant higher prices for everything they produce. And so the world stopped buying high-priced European goods and switched either to the Chinese or even the Americans, but particularly the Chinese. Europe was fading. Europe was becoming desperate. and the right wing could only hold on as the mass of people turned away from them by pretending they were saving their countries from the evil Russia, as if Russia was going to invade the rest of Europe, and by showing that they had a strong alliance with the United States, which Mr. Trump cleverly used to get them to accept almost everything. But now Mr. Trump has taken this game one step too far. He decides with Israel, not with Europe, to make a war on Iran. He didn't even inform the Europeans when he was going to do that. And then to ask them, in their very difficult circumstances, to incur the political costs, the financial costs, the military costs of being a junior partner in a war they don't understand, don't want, and can't afford. They're barely holding on in Ukraine. Or to be more honest, they're losing in Ukraine. They don't need another war they may lose. And so they said no. So now Mr. Trump is all alone, with Israel. That's being more alone, worse than without Israel. What is the cost of the war? Isolation. Europe now understands in the most dramatic way that their relationship with the United States is over. It's a divorce, and it's not pleasant, and it's not nice. And we're going to see the ugly outcome of a messy divorce all over the place in the months and years to come, if not sooner. Meanwhile, the Iran war will continue. Gas prices have risen in this country 30% to fill up your tank of your car. If you're a trucker bringing food and everything else to the stores of America, you use diesel. And diesel has gone up by 40%, meaning everything that is trucked to your consumer place will cost you more in the months ahead. 8 million people are officially unemployed in the United States. Employment is not getting any better. Inflation is getting worse. Welcome to the presidency of Mr. Trump. Of course, he's trying to control the autumn election in November, because what he's doing is a recipe for disaster for the Republicans at the polls, leaving them with one final outcome: either prevent the election or rewrite the rules of the election so that you will not suffer what everything you're doing is bringing to pass. The isolation that the United States thought it could surround China with has boomeranged. What's becoming isolated is the United States. And the war on Iran will be a memorial of sorts, a little bit like the very late behavior of the guilty Belgian government for the horrific crimes it committed in Africa for so many years. If interventions like these strike you as useful, please share them with friends, neighbors, co-workers. That's why we make them. And if you can help us finance the costs of doing this, that would be appreciated as well, and very, very much. Thank you.